The courtroom echoed with laughter as two cops mocked a black man standing before the judge. Their arrogance filled the room until he rose, calm but firm. The smirks faded when he revealed the truth. The man they ridiculed was none other than the FBI director. The seeds of the courtroom drama were planted long before Marcus Reed entered the chamber in his tailored black suit. To truly understand the magnitude of what unfolded that day, we must return to the night it all began. A night that revealed both the arrogance of power and the fragility of justice when tainted by prejudice. It was late evening when Marcus drove through a quiet residential neighborhood. His car, a sleek black sedan, drew the attention of Officers Miller and Grant, two patrolmen with reputations in their precinct. To them, the sight of a black man behind the wheel of a high-end vehicle was enough to arouse suspicion. Their rationale was thin, but their intentions were clear. Stop him, question him, and remind him who held authority. The flashing red and blue lights filled Marcus's rearview mirror. Calmly, he pulled to the side, rolled down his window, and waited. "License and registration," Miller barked, already peering into the car as though expecting to find contraband. Marcus handed over his documents without hesitation. "Is there a reason I was stopped, officer?" he asked in an even tone. Grant smirked from the passenger side. "We'll be the ones asking questions tonight." What began as a simple exchange quickly escalated. The officers pressed Marcus on where he was going, why he was in this neighborhood, and how he could afford such a car. Their voices carried condescension, their questions dripping with the assumption of guilt. Marcus answered calmly, refusing to mirror their hostility. When Miller accused him of resisting by asking questions, the situation turned. Within minutes, Marcus was ordered out of the car, frisked, and handcuffed on the hood while passers-by watched. No evidence, no clear charge, just suspicion, bolstered by prejudice. At the precinct, the harassment continued. The officers filled out paperwork accusing Marcus of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. They laughed as they wrote the report, confident that their word would be accepted over his. To them, it was routine. They had done it before. They expected the system to back them, as it always had. Marcus, however, remained composed. He provided no resistance, no angry outbursts. He knew that every word spoken, every reaction displayed, could and would be twisted against him. Instead, he quietly waited, his silence both a shield and a strategy. By morning, he was scheduled for arraignment. The case was minor, on paper, a simple resisting arrest charge, but the reality was much larger. It was the weight of countless encounters where authority became abuse and where prejudice dictated outcomes long before evidence was heard. When Marcus walked into the courtroom, the officers were already seated, whispering to one another with smug grins. They pointed at him subtly, chuckling under their breath. To them, this was another victory in a long line of unchecked misconduct. Judge Harrison, an older man with years on the bench, presided over the session. His demeanor was detached, his tone procedural. He gave little indication that he noticed or cared about the behavior of the officers. The prosecutor, relying almost entirely on the officers' testimony, presented the charges as though they were beyond question. After all, in many cases like this, the word of two uniformed officers outweighed the defense of a single defendant, especially one who, by appearance alone, seemed ordinary. Marcus sat quietly at the defense table, hands folded, expression calm. He wore no handcuffs now, but the weight of prejudice hung heavy in the air. The defense attorney assigned to his case barely spoke, offering only procedural remarks. It was clear to Marcus that the system had already drawn its conclusions. As testimony began, Miller took the stand. He spoke confidently, recounting a version of events where Marcus had been aggressive, uncooperative, and hostile. He described a scenario in which he and Grant had been forced to subdue a threatening suspect. His words were polished, practiced, designed to paint Marcus as the aggressor. Grant followed with a similar account, adding small details meant to reinforce the narrative. While they testified, both officers glanced toward Marcus, smirking. They whispered to one another, occasionally chuckling as if sharing a private joke. Their arrogance filled the room, unchecked by the judge, unchallenged by the prosecutor, and ignored by most of the audience. For them, this was routine. Another black man, another open and shut case, another moment to laugh at someone they believed had no power. For Marcus, sitting in silence was not easy. The accusations against him were false, insulting, and designed to undermine his dignity. Yet he did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he allowed the officers to dig deeper into their own lies. The judge, perhaps too accustomed to such cases, listened passively. The defense lawyer's minimal objections were brushed aside. The prosecutor leaned on the credibility of law enforcement as though it were unassailable. The imbalance was stark. Anyone watching closely could see it. But many in the audience chose not to look too closely. For them, this was just another case among many. To challenge the narrative would mean confronting uncomfortable truths about justice itself. What set this moment apart was not the injustice. It was Marcus's response to it. His silence was not surrender. It was calculation. He knew that reacting emotionally would play into their narrative. He knew that anger would confirm the stereotypes they relied upon. Instead, he observed. He waited. He allowed every word of testimony, every smirk, every dismissive gesture to unfold without interruption. He understood that timing was everything, and that the weight of truth carried more impact when revealed at the right moment. The officers mistook his silence for weakness. The prosecutor saw it as passivity. Even the judge seemed to interpret it as resignation. But those who watched more carefully noticed something different. There was a steadiness in Marcus's demeanor, a quiet confidence that suggested he was not nearly as powerless as he appeared. Throughout the testimony, the audience shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads at the officer's arrogance. Others whispered quietly, sensing that something was amiss. Yet no one spoke up. The silence of the audience mirrored the larger silence of society, the silence that allows misconduct to persist, that permits prejudice to masquerade as justice. Marcus, however, understood this silence. He knew it was not approval, but fear. Fear of challenging authority. Fear of standing against a system that often punished those who resisted it. As the prosecutor rested his case, the tension in the room grew. The narrative had been laid. Marcus as the aggressor, the officers as the victims of his defiance. On paper, it was compelling. To those who did not look deeper, it seemed convincing. But beneath the surface, the cracks were visible. The officers' overconfidence, their smirks, their laughter, it all revealed something more. It revealed the assumption that they were untouchable, that their word alone could shape reality. Marcus sat still, waiting for his turn. The room buzzed with anticipation, though few could articulate why. Something about his demeanor, his patience, suggested that the story was not yet complete. As the judge prepared to hear from the defense, Marcus finally adjusted in his seat. His movement drew subtle attention, as though the audience sensed a shift was coming. The officers continued to smirk, their confidence unshaken. What they did not know, what no one in the courtroom yet realized, was that Marcus carried with him not only the truth of what had happened that night, but also the authority to expose the entire charade. His moment was approaching, and when it came, it would not simply challenge the officers' testimony. It would dismantle their arrogance, shatter their confidence, and redefine the very power dynamics of the courtroom. The laughter that once filled the chamber would soon be silenced, not by anger, not by protest, but by revelation. The moment arrived when the judge turned his gaze toward the defense table, expecting the attorney to offer a few routine remarks before moving to sentencing. Instead, Marcus himself rose from his seat. The rustle of his suit, the quiet push of the chair against the wooden floor. Small sounds that carried unexpected weight in the suddenly hushed courtroom. For the first time that day, All eyes shifted toward him. Judge Harrison raised a brow, slightly annoyed. "Mr. Reed, do you have something to say before we proceed?" His tone was impatient, as though he were indulging a formality. Marcus's voice was steady, calm, and controlled. "Yes, Your Honor. I believe the truth has yet to be fully presented." A murmur swept through the audience. The officers leaned back in their seats, smirking once more, as if amused that the man they had mocked all morning now believed he could sway the outcome with a few words. To them, this was entertainment, one final act in a play they had already won. Marcus reached into his inner jacket pocket. The bailiff tensed instinctively, ready to intervene, but Marcus moved slowly, deliberately. He pulled out a leather case, opened it with precision, and held it up for the court to see. The emblem gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the golden badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Gasps rippled through the room. "This," Marcus said evenly, "is not just a badge. It is a responsibility. A responsibility I carry every day as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The room froze. The laughter, the smirks, the whispers, gone in an instant. Miller's face drained of color. Grant's jaw tightened, his earlier confidence shattered. The judge leaned forward, eyes wide, suddenly alert in a way he had not been before. Even the prosecutor blinked rapidly as though trying to process what he had just heard. For years, the officers had wielded their uniforms as shields, convinced they were untouchable. In an instant, Marcus had turned that shield into a spotlight, exposing their arrogance and misconduct not before an ordinary defendant, but before one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the nation. He continued, his tone still calm but now carrying an undeniable authority. "Last night I was stopped without cause. I was questioned, harassed, and ultimately arrested for nothing more than existing in a neighborhood where you believed I did not belong. Every word spoken against me in this courtroom has been a fabrication, designed to justify your misconduct. And you laughed at what you assumed was another powerless man trapped by a system you could manipulate." The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. No one dared move. Even the air felt heavier. Marcus let the weight of his words hang before continuing. "I remained silent because I wanted to see the process unfold. I wanted to witness firsthand how easily the truth could be buried under arrogance, prejudice, and institutional complacency. And I have seen enough. Officers Miller and Grant, your behavior last night and again in this courtroom today represents not law enforcement but lawlessness. You betrayed your oath, and in doing so, you dishonored the badge you wear." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier smirk replaced by a nervous twitch of his lips. Grant looked down at the table, his hands fidgeting, avoiding eye contact. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, his tone suddenly respectful. "Director Reed, if what you say is accurate..." Marcus turned his gaze sharply toward the bench, and the judge stopped mid-sentence. "With all due respect, Your Honor, accuracy is not in question. What happened is a matter of record. Dash cam footage, body cam footage, and internal reports, all of which are already in my possession. The only question is whether this court has the courage to confront the truth." The prosecutor, pale and shaken, attempted to recover. "Your Honor, perhaps we should..." Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through like a blade. "Perhaps you should ask yourself why your case relied solely on the testimony of 2 officers without even reviewing the available evidence. That oversight is not a mistake. It is a symptom of a deeper problem." The audience sat stunned, many with their mouths slightly open. For some, the shock came from the revelation of Marcus's true identity. For others, it was the realization that they had just witnessed the entire justice process exposed for its flaws in real time. Marcus closed his badge case and returned it to his pocket. Then he turned his attention back to the officers. "You assumed my silence was weakness, but silence, when chosen, is often strategy. I gave you every opportunity to tell the truth. Instead, you doubled down on lies, and now the lies end. The weight of authority in his voice was undeniable. He was no longer the defendant in their narrative. He was the arbiter, the overseer, the man whose decisions could alter the course of their lives and careers. The shift was absolute. Judge Harrison, visibly unsettled, adjusted his robe nervously. Director Reed, in light of this revelation, I believe immediate action must be taken. Officers Miller and Grant, you are hereby remanded for contempt of court and potential charges of perjury and misconduct pending review. His voice, once detached, now trembled with urgency. The bailiff moved quickly toward the officers. Miller tried to protest, his voice cracking as he stammered, Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. Grant rose to his feet, hands raised slightly as if pleading. We didn't know who he was. Marcus raised a hand, silencing them both. That is precisely the problem. You believed your behavior was acceptable because you thought I was powerless. Your actions should not depend on who a person is, but on the principles of justice you swore to uphold. You failed that oath. As the officers were led away in handcuffs, the courtroom buzzed with whispers, shock, and disbelief. The power dynamic had been flipped completely. Moments earlier, they had been the accusers, the confident enforcers of a false narrative. Now, they were defendants themselves, stripped of the authority they had abused. Marcus remained standing, his presence commanding the room. He looked out over the audience, his voice steady once more. This is not about me. I will be fine. I have power. I have resources. And I have the ability to defend myself. But countless others do not. They face what I faced last night. Harassment, false charges, laughter in the face of their pain, without the means to fight back. And their stories are too often buried. The words struck deeper than the revelation of his identity. They revealed the broader truth, that justice was not blind, but often selective, that the system itself could be bent, not by law, but by bias, and that silence, when imposed by fear, allowed injustice to thrive. The judge bowed his head slightly, a rare gesture of humility. The prosecutor looked down at his notes, avoiding Marcus's gaze. The audience, now fully engaged, listened with a mix of shame, awe, and respect. Marcus sat down again, his point made. He no longer needed to prove anything. The officer's downfall was complete, and the courtroom's silence was proof enough that the balance of power had shifted. The climax of the trial was not the revelation of a badge, but the exposure of a truth too many already knew, that justice, when poisoned by prejudice, ceases to be justice at all. The courtroom, once filled with laughter and casual arrogance, now simmered in stunned silence. The officers had been led away in handcuffs, their faces pale, their earlier confidence erased as quickly as it had appeared. The murmurs of disbelief from the gallery swelled and then quieted again as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. Moments before, Marcus Reed was just another defendant, another black man accused of resisting arrest. Now, the truth had unfolded, and the weight of his authority reverberated through every corner of the chamber. Judge Harrison, who had seemed detached and dismissive during the proceedings, now struggled to reassert control. His voice cracked slightly as he addressed the courtroom. This court will recess briefly while we address these extraordinary developments, he said, his gavel striking the desk with less force than usual. But recess was merely a procedural move. Everyone in the room knew that nothing would return to normal after what had transpired. Marcus sat calmly, his hands folded once more, his demeanor unchanged. That, more than anything, unsettled those who remained. His composure was not the relief of a man who had narrowly escaped injustice. It was the assurance of someone who had seen this play before, someone who knew the script too well and who had chosen this moment to rewrite it. The prosecutor leaned toward the bench, speaking in a hushed but urgent tone. He tried to recover, to find some footing in a case that had collapsed in real time. Your Honor, he began, Given the identity of the defendant and the circumstances, I believe we must reassess. Marcus's voice cut through again, firm but controlled. There will be no reassessment that buries the truth. This is no longer about me standing trial. This is about accountability. And accountability begins here, in this courtroom, with the very system that allowed arrogance to masquerade as justice. The words carried more weight than the gavel. The judge nodded stiffly, chastened, his earlier indifference replaced with discomfort. He understood that the trial was no longer his to control. It belonged to Marcus, and to the larger reality his presence exposed. As the recess concluded and the court resumed, the audience's demeanor had shifted. Many leaned forward in their seats, eager to witness what would follow. Some wore expressions of admiration, others of guilt. A few avoided eye contact entirely, unable to reconcile their silence during the officer's laughter with the courage Marcus had displayed in exposing them. The defense attorney, who until now had played a passive role, seemed invigorated by the shift. He rose and declared, "In light of the revelation of Director Reed's identity and the overwhelming misconduct of the arresting officers, I move to have all charges dismissed immediately and for the record to reflect the perjury committed in this courtroom." Judge Harrison cleared his throat, struggling to regain some sense of authority. "The motion is granted. All charges against Mr. Reed are hereby dismissed." His words were deliberate, heavy with the knowledge that his earlier passivity would not be forgotten. The dismissal, though expected, was symbolic. Marcus had not needed the court's validation to clear his name. The truth alone had already dismantled the false narrative. Yet, in that symbolic act, the system attempted to preserve some dignity, to paint itself as responsive rather than complicit. Marcus rose once more, turning to face the gallery. His voice, steady and deliberate, now carried not just to those present, but to the broader audience beyond the courtroom walls, for he knew his words would be repeated, analyzed, and remembered. "This case is closed for me," he began, "but it must open a larger conversation for all of us. What happened here is not unique. Every day, individuals face harassment, false accusations, and systemic bias without the means to defend themselves. They are silenced, not by evidence, but by assumptions rooted in prejudice and reinforced by complacency." His eyes swept across the audience, lingering on the prosecutors, the judge, the clerks, and the silent onlookers. "Today, you laughed at me. But your laughter was not just at me. It was at every person who has ever been told that their dignity is negotiable. Your laughter was a symptom of the disease of racism that infects not just individuals, but institutions." The gallery sat still, some faces reddened with shame. Even those who had said nothing now felt exposed. Marcus's words were not simply a rebuke, they were a mirror, forcing each person to confront their role in the silence that allowed injustice to fester. Judge Harrison, uncharacteristically solemn, spoke with a hint of humility. "Director Reed, your statement has been heard. This court acknowledges the gravity of these events and the need for accountability." His words were a rare concession, though they could not erase the memory of his earlier indifference. Marcus nodded slightly, but his gaze did not soften. Acknowledgement is not enough. Change must follow. Officers Miller and Grant will face the consequences of their actions, but they are not anomalies. They are products of a system that rewards arrogance and punishes vulnerability. That system must be confronted, not just by me, but by all of you who claim to serve justice. The defense attorney sat quietly, almost in awe. The prosecutor shifted uneasily, his pen tapping nervously against his pad. The bailiff stood still, avoiding eye contact. The room had transformed into something more than a courtroom. It had become a stage upon which the entire justice system was being indicted. Outside the courthouse, news of the revelation spread rapidly. Reporters scrambled to capture the story. The FBI director arrested, mocked, and falsely charged, only to turn the tables on his accusers. Cameras gathered, microphones waited, and a crowd began to form. When Marcus finally stepped outside, the flash of cameras lit up the steps. He paused, surrounded by microphones thrust forward. His words were measured as they had been inside. What happened to me is not the story. The story is why it happened, and to how many others it continues to happen every day. The problem is not exposure, it is repetition. How many more must face this humiliation before we admit that the system itself is flawed? The reporters pressed for more, but Marcus refused to be sensationalized. He gave no dramatic declarations, no personal attacks. Instead, he maintained the same analytical tone, redirecting every question back to the broader issue. "I am fortunate," he said, "because I can defend myself. But those without a title, without a badge, without influence, who defends them?" The crowd outside the courthouse erupted in a mix of applause and debate. Some cheered him as a hero, others questioned the implications. But what united them all was the undeniable fact that something extraordinary had occurred. A hidden truth about the imbalance of justice had been dragged into the light, and no one present could pretend they had not seen it. Inside, the officers sat in holding cells, their futures uncertain. For the first time, they were forced to confront the consequences of their arrogance. Their laughter, once a weapon, now echoed back at them as a reminder of how quickly power could evaporate when stripped of its illusion. Marcus, walking away from the courthouse steps, did not look triumphant. He looked resolute. This was not victory, it was exposure, and exposure, he knew, was only the beginning. The resolution of the courtroom drama was not in the dismissal of charges, nor in the arrest of the officers. It was in the shift of perception, the forced recognition that racism and arrogance, when unchecked, could not only distort justice, but humiliate it. The falling action of this story was not a gentle descent. It was a hard reckoning, leaving behind a question that demanded an answer. If this could happen to the director of the FBI, what happens to those without his power? And in that question lay the real weight of the moment. When the courthouse emptied that evening, the echoes of what had transpired lingered far beyond the stone walls. The story of Marcus Reed's revelation spread quickly, not just as breaking news, but as a narrative that forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. Commentators dissected every moment of the trial, the officers' laughter, the judge's passivity, the prosecutor's reliance on authority without evidence, and the instant reversal when Marcus revealed who he truly was. For some, it was a moment of vindication. For others, it was a chilling reminder of how fragile justice becomes when power and prejudice intersect. Marcus himself avoided the media spectacle that erupted. He declined interviews beyond his brief statement on the courthouse steps. Instead, he returned quietly to his office, resuming his work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. That, more than anything, spoke volumes. For him, this was not about personal triumph or public praise. It was about demonstrating in real time what so many had argued for decades, that the system bends not toward justice, but toward those it perceives as powerful. In the days that followed, the officers faced charges of misconduct, perjury, and abuse of authority. Their images, once symbols of law enforcement, became cautionary tales splashed across headlines. Yet their downfall, while satisfying to many, did not erase the deeper unease. The real question was not what would happen to two officers who laughed at the wrong man, but what would happen to the countless others who laughed without consequence, who mocked without exposure, who silenced the powerless without ever being caught. Across the nation, conversations ignited. Some praised Marcus for his restraint, his patience, and his strategy. Others criticized the fact that it took someone of his stature, someone with a badge and title, to force accountability. If he had been anyone else, one commentator observed, he would have walked away with a record instead of vindication. That observation resonated deeply, because it was true. The system had not suddenly revealed its fairness. It had revealed its bias. exposed only because it miscalculated the identity of the man it targeted. Marcus understood this better than anyone. In private discussions with his staff, he acknowledged that his case was not about him, but about the ordinary people who would never get the chance to pull out a badge that silenced the courtroom. He knew that systemic reform was not achieved through singular moments of exposure, but through consistent pressure and accountability. His words inside the courtroom had not been for himself. They had been for every individual whose silence was not a strategy but a forced condition of survival. The judge, chastened by the embarrassment of the case, issued a public statement days later, promising stricter oversight of courtroom conduct and a review of how testimony was weighed. But promises were just words, and Marcus knew words alone did not dismantle systems. Change would be measured not in statements but in outcomes. The prosecutor's office, facing its own criticism, announced new training programs and internal reviews. Yet even those announcements carried the scent of damage control rather than genuine reform. What remained most powerful was the image of the officer's frozen expressions the moment Marcus revealed his identity. It was not just the shock of discovery, it was the collapse of an illusion. For years, their confidence came not from truth, but from the certainty that the system would protect them. That certainty shattered in an instant, exposing how quickly arrogance crumbles when stripped of its shield. But again, the haunting truth persisted. For every Marcus Reed, there were countless others whose revelations would never come, whose stories would remain buried beneath paperwork and silence. In the broader discourse, analysts framed the event as a test case of institutional bias. They noted how the judge's demeanor shifted only after power entered the equation, how the prosecutor abandoned his certainty only when confronted with rank. The irony was unavoidable. Justice had bent not toward fairness, but toward authority. And in that irony lay the essence of the problem. For Marcus, the epilogue was not about reflection on personal victory, but about returning to the work that lay ahead. He convened a private meeting with senior officials, demanding not only an internal review, but also a plan to address the wider issue of racial bias in law enforcement interactions. His insistence was not on policy alone, but on culture, on changing the unspoken assumptions that allowed two officers to laugh openly at a man they thought powerless. He reminded them of a simple truth: justice is not measured by how it treats the powerful, but by how it treats the powerless. In his own case, justice had been twisted until power corrected it. That correction, while dramatic, was not justice. It was survival. True justice, Marcus argued, would mean that no one needed a badge or a title to be treated with dignity. As days turned into weeks, the story faded from headlines, replaced by the next scandal, the next crisis, but its memory lingered, etched in the minds of those who had witnessed it firsthand. For the audience in that courtroom, the lesson was searing. The sound of laughter can become the sound of downfall when truth arrives. For society at large, the lesson was heavier. If the director of the FBI could be mocked, arrested, and falsely accused, what chance did the ordinary citizen have? Marcus himself carried on, unchanged in demeanor but sharpened in resolve. He did not see the incident as a personal humiliation, but as evidence that the system was as fragile and flawed as critics had long claimed, evidence that change was not optional, but urgent. The conclusion of this story was not a neat resolution, not a triumph that erased injustice. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting its most uncomfortable truths. The courtroom may have dismissed the charges, but the real case, the case against systemic prejudice, remained unresolved. Marcus had forced it into the open, but the verdict belonged to the future, to whether society would confront what it had seen or retreat once more into silence. And so, the laughter that once echoed through the courtroom no longer mattered. What mattered was what followed: the conversations, the reckoning, and the recognition that dignity cannot depend on titles, and justice cannot depend on power. If it does, then it is not justice at all.